The Last Enemy. Written by Caleb M. Powers. Read by the author. To my father, who first showed me that the future was bright. Every morning, Death was awoken by his governess at 7 a.m. sharp. Most children would be reluctant to crawl out of their soft, dark den of fleece blankets and feather pillows, an Ursus arctos being roused out of its long hibernation by a nagging she-wolf. But Death always threw off the covers like a servant's boy on Boxing Day, squinting with a smile at the volcanic glow of the sunrise refracting off the walls of his room. The governess would lead him through his options for breakfast, and then the morning, afternoon, and evening outfits, as well as inform him of his schedule. Death picked out each item with the grave decorum that came with his position, and then was led into the next room to be bathed, dressed, and groomed for the day's work. When he was finished, he lined up in the hallway with each of his 5 siblings for the final morning inspection. The governess would walk down the single-file line, straightening Blindness's jacket or signing a terse reminder to Deafness that he would promptly ignore. Sometimes she would tuck in Flesh's shirt, straighten Darkness's posture, or tighten the world's belt a notch or two. She never had to realign, correct, or rebuke Death. She would merely glance at him and nod, and he would nod back, smiling. It would never do, of course, for Death to be anything but the picture of perfection. He was the oldest, after all, and so he was something of a role model to the others. With a sharp whistle from the governess, Death would lead the others down the hallway, down the stairs, and into the dining room, which sparkled with crystal chandeliers catching the morning light. Their meals would be ready for them, sitting on the long table like so many ducks in a row, and they would each take their seat and eat in silence, while the governess paced around them, a felis caddis that was full of both food and sleep, devoid of anything more feline to do but prowl. The head of the table sat empty. Their father had been long gone now, so long ago that he was almost a distant memory in the back of their minds, a forgotten toy in a closet that was never opened. Death had killed him, of course. There wasn't anyone in a coffin that hadn't been put there by his own cold hands, but it wasn't anything personal. Nothing ever really was with him. Death's father had rarely ever sat at the head of the table anyway. Usually at this point of the day, he would have been in the corner of the room at a small desk, typing out another apology letter on the dusty old typewriter, hunched over like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. And that was a heavy weight to carry, as the world was going on 400 pounds most days. Death took another bite of the boiled cabbage on his plate and tried to picture what his father's face looked like. It had been so long since he'd seen him, expression intent over a page filled with sorrow over eating a single piece of fruit. All he could really imagine was the sunken eye holes of an ash-white skull. Death sipped his morning tea. He supposed that's what his father looked like now anyway. After breakfast, the 6 of them were hurried out into the foyer, where they were donned with their sashes, black and purple, and brought through their itineraries for the day's work. A servant opened the front door, letting in the still, cool morning air and their driver, who took off his hat and waited at attention near the landing. The drone of the governess's voice faded into the back of Death's mind as his gaze focused on the simple brass buttons, 8 in all, that ran up the driver's coat. Death had never spoken a word to the driver, and the driver had never spoken a word to him. But they seemed to have a shared understanding for the importance of the work that was being done every day in the city, and Death had always appreciated the man for that. Finally, the governess finished her detailed explanation of the same thing they did every day, and had done every day from the beginning of time, and the 6 of them climbed into the cabin of the car and sat and twiddled their thumbs as the engine roared to life and they groaned down the extensive driveway towards the road proper. They spent the afternoon visiting their subjects. Their driver would bring them to several of the famous landmarks of the city, where people had gathered to see their rulers and wait to be touched by their black gloves and soft faces. They climbed out one by one and split up the crowd among them. Blindness and Deafness would take turns covering eyes and ears as the masses oohed and awed, their senses dulled. Darkness would steal among the crowd like a wraith, blotting out the midday sun and sending a chill down the spines of every man, woman, and child he passed. The shivers of pleasure were like a wave dancing in the wind. Flesh caused similar shivers, but Death tried to keep his eyes averted from what he did. Even he had little patience for flesh. The world was the only one of the brothers that didn't go to the people. Rather, the people came to him, in trickles at first, but then flocks and droves, alternatively bowing and scraping their heads against the stone courtyard near him or reaching out a hand to touch his girth. The world laughed raucously at the attention, and the people laughed in response, as if they had heard some joke that Death missed. Death wondered what the people were really experiencing when his brothers gave them their boons. He might envy them and the pleasure they seemed to give these people, except that Death understood more than anyone else that the gifts they gave their subjects were merely foretastes of the greatest gift of all, his brothers only heralds for the true treasure. As Death watched the people moan and writhe and dance among the stones of the courtyard, he kept his eyes ever searching, like a boutea jamacensis looking for a single gray rabbit. A woman in the corner of the crowd caught his gaze. She had been visited by flesh earlier and now lay on the ground, almost comatose, surrounded by her peers and their trampling feet. She seemed miraculously unscathed, but Death knew better. He folded his hands behind his back and took slow, small, deliberate steps towards the woman, counting the seconds with each footfall. 1, 2, 3, and with each step he counted out the last heartbeats of the woman on the ground. When he finally reached her, she looked up, though her eyes showed little understanding for what was happening to her. She seemed distant but unperturbed, as if gazing at Death she only saw her own reflection in a mirror. They all seemed like that, in the second-to-last moment. The very ultimate second, however, was something completely different. Death reached out with a black-gloved hand and touched her face, and she suddenly and furiously let out a scream. One single eternal scream that seemed to rip into the very concept of sound itself, tearing the abstract to very concrete shreds and then atomizing them even further into oblivion. Time seemed to have no meaning as every other member of the crowd lay frozen in their writhing dance. Death looked into the woman's eyes, which were cloudy with visits from blindness. He glanced at her ears, bleeding from deafness. He saw her dress, torn and ripped by flesh's searching claws, her skin blackened to ash by darkness's advances, and her throat ragged and raw from laughing with the world. And then, as the woman's last vestiges of breath fled her lips, and the scream that she had held for what seemed like a crystallized moment of forever finally ended, Death killed her. With barely a shudder more, she was gone. The crowd hesitated for just the merest fraction of a second before continuing their merrymaking. Death stepped away from the crowd, making popping sounds with his mouth until he reached the driver and their car. He stepped into the cabin and nodded once to the driver, and then they were off, back to the estate. The driver, like always, didn't question Death. Death knew when his job was done, and there would be no more gifts to grant today. Not for him. It didn't bother him much. He could spend the rest of the afternoon flipping through some of his favorite taxonomy primers. A boy needed a hobby, after all. Death glanced out the window, noting the black and purple flags draped over every other building, the insignia of his family etched so boldly into the fabric. He felt a bit of pride in what they had accomplished here. He would have said that their father would be proud of them as well, but the man had spent every waking moment drafting letters in response to the mountain of mail he had received while he had been with them. Death imagined that wherever he was now, he would be doing the same thing even still. In any case, Death's father had hated him, had hated all his children. Granted, their father hadn't meant to conceive a single one of them, so that would put a damper on familial relationships, but Death had always felt a little resentful at the way he'd been treated. It didn't help that all of the apology letters Death's father drafted were to apologize for his eldest son's existence. As they pulled into the estate and Death began to climb out of the car, he looked back over the city, still mostly visible from the hill their manor stood atop. He smiled as his contemplations from the ride here filled him with a new awe for the cityscape he saw below. The smile only lasted a few moments before he frowned. Away in the distance, he saw something white, something clean, pure, unsoiled. He hated it. It was coming closer, almost a flash as it seemed to gain momentum on the horizon. Death tried to focus his eyes on the distant point, but had to look away at the brightness. This wasn't like the sun. This wasn't like any light he had seen. This was something different, something opposite. It all happened so slowly at first. The pinprick on the horizon grew in size until it was obvious what it was, an army come to conquer. Death gathered his brothers together and they discussed strategy, overseen by the governess, who was still pacing, but this time more like a Panthera Leo than any domestic beast. She gave them orders like a general on the battlefield, and truly a battlefield the city now was. The 6 brothers gathered their citizens into legions, sending them out to slow the advance of the enemy army, their forces fierce and fueled by all the motivation the boons of their rulers could offer. The advancing army seemed to fall back, nearly beaten, and the brothers rejoiced at their victory while the governess looked on as if waiting for something, still anxious. That night they feasted together and fell asleep full and satisfied. The next morning, no one came to awaken Death. He slept in until 7:15. He searched the estate high and low, looking for the governess, but she was nowhere to be found. That was when everything really started to fall apart. The army seemed to gather its brilliance once more, and the light was blinding. It was as if a million suns lay just beyond their walls. The stalemate that the 2 armies had seemed to be locked in before broke, and the shining army attacked. After that, the brothers and their army lost ground. The shining army reached the walls and tore them down. Even the 2 glorious black gates of the city, Hades and Gehenna, fell before the onslaught. That was when the army began to renovate. Instead of leaving ashes in their midst, they instead converted the city behind them, building it bigger and better than before. They tore down the black and purple flags of the royal family and replaced it with some foreign insignia, draped in white and purple and gold. Even the fallen soldiers, once citizens of the brothers' domain, rose to animation at the behest of the Shining Legion, falling in step with the rest of the brilliant horde. Death imagined a foreign king somewhere in the distance, beyond his field of vision, planning out the war as he and his brothers were doing now. Unfortunately, without the governess to guide them, the brothers felt lost and confused. Their army lashed out with ferocity at the invaders before them, but it seemed as if each time their attacks grew weaker and weaker, as if the very presence of the other army was draining their strength. The brothers decided to lead the fight personally, donning helms and riding into battle on pale stallions, but that only accelerated the slaughter. With such noticeable and important targets, the Shining Army seemed emboldened to attack harder and faster and with greater frequency. Those who had once been under their thrall seemed to be most avid in vengeance against their former masters. Blindness fell first, and then his twin, deafness. Darkness couldn't last long against the brilliance that was the army, and Flesh, as stubborn as he was and as many tricks as he had up his oily sleeves, died with an arrow in his throat as easily as any common man. The world fell next, as if to packs of Canis lupus, and when finally the army reached the estate itself, only Death remained. On the last day, Death was awakened sharply at 7 a.m. by the governess. She had been captured and locked away, it seemed, by enemy spies, and only now had she managed to claw her way out again and come back to him. Death was determined, on this day of all days, to win the war. To bring himself to the Shining Army and its commanders, and thus bring hell along with Death. Death and the governess gathered up what remaining strength they had and met the Shining Army on the field of battle. They saw the city, formerly theirs, now shining with the same brilliance that epitomized the army. They had remade the entire thing in their distant king's image. It made Death sick, and he tried to look somewhere, anywhere, but at the nauseous vibrancy that seemed to be all around him now. The governess whispered him his itinerary one last time. Kill. Death obliged. The carnage was tremendous. Bodies littered the ground, and the smell of blood and viscera was sweet in Death's nostrils. It seemed as if the day was finally won for a single moment, not unlike that crystallized time before Death had seen the army on that first day. The Shining Army hung back, retreating for the only time that Death could remember. But then, Death heard the horns, a royal fanfare, marking the arrival of the king himself. Riding with him was Death's father, who no longer seemed hunched and forlorn, but peaceful and serene, a new, changed man. Death hated him. Death hated them all. He began to raise his hand to kill them all finally and completely, to bring this entire mess to a single, lethal close. But the king raised his hand instead, and then Death died. Acknowledgements. First off, I'd like to thank my father, who first introduced me to the hope that is optimistic eschatology, as well as Kenneth Gentry, who gave me a robust, thorough understanding of it. I'd also like to thank Kelly Wells, whose strange metaphorical fiction inspired me to write this story. Lastly, I'd like to thank Marilyn Annucci, my professor for the creative nonfiction class I took in college that prompted me to write this story in the first place, and the fellow students who gave me great feedback to tighten the prose. This concludes the reading of The Last Enemy by Caleb M. Powers, read by the author. Thanks for listening.